So where are we holding? So we were talking about, in our last discussion, we were talking about the difference between giving tzedakah according to the needs of the community. Oh, forgot the dongle. Versus giving tzedakah based on a person tithing 10%. And there was some level of equivocation as far as how do the two reconcile with each other? And if the needs of the community are greater than 10%, does a person have an obligation? Okay, so we left that sort of off with a question. We don't really know whether there would be an obligation to give more in a situation where the communal needs are greater. But certainly when the communal needs are less than 10%, if a person were to choose to, let's say, because he says, I can't afford the 10%, he would be allowed to fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah by just taking care of the needs of the community after making some type of calculus having to do with how many poor people are in our community, how much wealth is in our community, and how much should I be contributing based on my income, which is, again, can get very complicated, right? And there's no true way to know the answer to that. Okay, now this next shaila is a pretty fundamental shaila. Ha'im yesh chiyuv latet ma'aser ksafim. We said Chazal strongly recommended, right? So does that mean that there's a halachic obligation to give 10%? Okay, so he says the tshuva is as follows, and I think we had seen a little bit of this when we had studied the first section of the Sefer as well. How do we frame the mitzvah of ma'aser ksafim? So he says, Be'inyan mahus chiv ma'aser ksafim matzanu kama shitot. He says, as far as the nature of this mitzvah, whether it's an obligation, recommendation, and so forth, we find a number of different shitot. And let's see, how many is he going to be giving us here? He says, let me just see how long this goes for. Oh, well. There's only 3 opinions that he's going to be presenting us with. Okay, fine. So let's see what these 3 opinions are. Hataz nakat shema'aser ksafim hu chiyuv gamur v'sheyesh l'damoto l'ma'aser ani shel hatavua. He says the Taz in Siman Shin Lamed Aleph in Yoredeya is of the opinion that it is an absolute obligation, a rabbinic obligation, and it is no different from Maaser Ani, the tithe that a person has to take from his wheat after taking Truma and Maaser for the Kohen and the Levi. Then the halacha was that in certain years you were supposed to take Maaser Ani. In the 3rd and the 6th year, you were supposed to take Maaser Ani in addition to that, which is 10% of whatever your remaining wheat is. Umemela eno mishtane lefi hayacholet shel mi sheme'aser ulaolam hu asirit meharevach. And according to the Taz, therefore, it makes no difference what a person's economic status is. Even if they're of a lower economic status, we're taking a 10% cut off of your net. It would be a hardship. You are nevertheless obligated to do so. Number 2, that's one opinion. Number 2, poskim rabim cholkim al hataz. There are many poskim who disagree with the Taz. Vehem, habach, achasim sofer, achavos yoyer, asheilas yaivitz va'od. Vehem nakdu she'ein chiyuv le'teit ma'aser ksafim va'afilu minhag ein bazeh. Their opinion is that there is no obligation to give 10% of your income to tzedakah, and there's not even such a minhag, which is surprising because that seems to be a prevailing minhag today, for people to tithe. Now you have the 3rd opinion, that is of the Birkei Yosef. Nakat shechiyuv ma'aser ksafim Uchiyav gamur midarabanan. He says it is, like the Taz says, a rabbinic obligation. However, ulam nahagu ha'olam lahakil bo. However, there is a pervasive sense of leniency on this rabbinic ordinance. Mikivan shemiikar hadin mutar lenakot mehamaaser hotzaot banav me'al gil sheish. Because a person would be allowed to, let's say, deduct from his meiser any expenses that he spends for his children once they reach the age of 6. Okay? In other words, according to the Gemara, I only have an obligation to support my children up until the age of 6 years old. Afterwards, I can kick him out of the house and tell him to get a job. Now, usually, the minhag has changed. It's now up to 36 instead of 6. But right. But based on the Gemara's age, the idea then becomes that if a person is blessed with children, they can basically say, well, okay, fine. I know I have to give a 10th, but I can give my 10th to my children. In other words, and that counts as tzedakah as well. Be'al pi rov hein yoter mima'aser. And in most situations, you're giving much more than 10% of your income to your children over the age of 6. So that would be one reason to sort of not be so machmir, because when you consider how much you spend on your children, you realize you've spent a lot of your income on people who you're not obligated to support, and that in itself is a form of tzedakah. Okay, so that's the argument. V'hosef habirkei Yosef shemisha matzavo lo dachu kol kach v'yachol lahafrish ma'aser belila nakot hotzaot banav lo nachon lismoch al haminyan kedei liftar asasma. But then the Birkei Yosef concludes that if a person is blessed with additional disposable income, and you can support your children and at the same time take 10%, it's better not to rely on this leniency, and taka, try your best to do the tithe to the best of your ability. Okay, so those are the three opinions, and it seems that many people just take it for granted that we go like the Taz. But as you can see, there's three different opinions: the most stringent, the most lenient, and somewhere in between, right? Okay. So in the commentaries, we're going to expand on this just a little bit. So he quotes the Bach, and he says, "Kasav v'zelashano aval masha adam me'aser mimashe marviach b'masa u'matan b'ksafim u'shar revachim eno bichlal zeh demaiser ani." He says, when a person, there's a noted minhag that a person tithes all of his profits after deducting his expenses, whatever he profits from his business. He says that's not in the category of maser ani that the Torah prescribes from your agriculture. And therefore, it doesn't have to be given specifically to the poor. It could be given for tzedakah. It could be given for pidyon shvuyim, which is ransoming captives, which is not formally the mitzvah of tzedakah. It's a different mitzvah. Ransoming captives used to be a very popular mitzvah, not as popular anymore. In Mexico, it probably still exists. No, seriously. Did the community ever take up a collection for someone who was kidnapped? There's an insurance.
People buy insurance. The problem, kidnappers know that if they have an insurance, they even ask for more. So that's you have to keep it very quiet. So people ask for $1 million, $2 million, $10 million insurance, and it's common now. Especially in the community.
So, what would $1 million?
I know it's my friend has
For each child.
For themselves, it's like a family
plan.
Yeah. But it's sad because if you see how it's like normal, and people say, And it's deductible from the business, it's like a business expense.
How common is this in Mexico?
More than you think. The problem is that before you used to hear from these people, this guy. Now it's like family members. So it's like,
And what if a person doesn't have a policy?
well, first of all, I think they are in less risk because the problem in Mexico is the corruption is so badly that the same insurance, who you trust in the insurance company, because the insurance company they know this guy is for $10 million, it's a target for them. So the higher the insurance it's a better target for them. It's like driving a nice car. You have a last model Mercedes Benz, you're a target. You are showing that you have. So the same idea with insurance. So you have to keep it very, very low profile. But the problem is who you trust in Mexico for insurance. But this is popular. Everybody has insurance now. So and if you don't have an insurance, you may be, and if you keep in a low profile, maybe you should be okay. But let's say if you're in a traffic light and you have a very fancy car, the probability is you're going to be hit more than the guy who has a Volkswagen behind you. Why? Because you have a better watch, have a wallet with you, a bag, the bag for the one. So, and they do that. They do. The little kids that come and look through your window, asking for money, they put a chewing gum on your door. So the next traffic, like they know that they have an expensive bag or they have something on the car, a computer or a cell phone. So they know right away. So they have different tactics to and that's the way they work. So that was the main reason I left Mexico.
Yeah. So that's why you left. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Pidyon Shvuyim, it used to be a popular mitzvah, and when I said it still goes on in Mexico, right? If let's say a person were to get kidnapped and they didn't have a policy, has the Jewish community ever taken up a collection?
Actually, before the insurance, that was the case. But because it was very often, they stopped doing that because it was not one case, it was many cases. So they used to be that the community that they have even a special fund that the people donate, and they have special fund for that.
For Pidyon Shvuyim? Yeah. Thank God we don't know it's not, I mean, it's rough in South Africa too, but I don't know if they'd specifically do kidnapping, but
It means it's electric because it's going to fight.
And then with the armored cars, it's very popular. Everybody has an armored car.
an armored car.
Yeah. Why? Because you get better chance to go away.
Okay. Anyway, so in other words, you can use your 10% at your own discretion and not specifically give it to the poor. You can use it for other mitzvahs, specifically because there is no obligation to tithe your income for the poor, right? There's a minhag to tithe income, but it could be done for any mitzvah that you'd like. That's the opinion of the Bach. So the Yavitz also says the same thing. He says, "V'yeshli raya mefureshes she'ein ikar l'maiser ksafim afilu midivreihem ad kan l'shana." He says, I can prove that there's not even a rabbinic obligation to tithe your income. Harei lahedja she'ein chiv afilu midrabanan. So you see, even rabbinically, he holds that there's no obligation. V'hemshech dvarav kasav zel l'shana. Aval Yisrael Kedoshim Heim Hichmiru al Atzman B'chol Artzos Ashkenaz. He says, nonetheless, despite the fact that there's no basis for this in the traditional writings, but Yisrael are Kedoshim. The Jewish people are holy people, and they accepted this chumrah upon themselves in all European countries. He says, Artzos Ashkenaz, in all Germanic countries. Kiyamu v'kiblu aleihim chok v'lo yavor. La'aser mamon hanedunya shemachnisim lahazug kidei shetashre bracha b'mamonam. He says that's what he says. He says that the minhag became that whenever a nedunya, which is a dowry, is given to a couple, remember that was the purpose of the Tanoim document. The Tanoim document basically includes all of the funds. It used to, traditionally, it doesn't do that anymore. But basically, the two fathers would enter into an agreement as to exactly how much money and what goods were being given to the chassan and kala to start their matrimonial home. And the practice was to take 10% of that money and to give it to charity. And it was a way of ensuring that the young couple would be blessed. That was the reason why it was that it became the standard minhag in the times of the Ivets. So you see that the minhag in the Ivets' time was only to take 10% of the dowry, but not of a person's annual income. So, okay, that's fine. Now remember, we're dealing with in communities where there is abject poverty. So to expect people to tithe their income regularly was not something that was within most people's reach. And then he quotes the Chassam Sofer. He says, "V'gam b'shut Chassam Sofer kosav she'ein chiyuv afilu mitzad minhag v'zel shano." He says the Chassam Sofer writes that there's not even such an obligation based on minhag. He says, "Eliyaan dahach meiser ksafim eno chiyuv mamish." He says it's not mamish a chiyuv, not mamish an obligation. Yesh mafrishim v'yesh she'ena mafrishim. There are those who tithe, and there are those who do not tithe. V'imkein bevadai im lo hayanohig lahafrish meiser mi yitva'enu u'mi yechafno. He says, and if a person decides not to tithe, how can anyone have a grievance or demand payment or to try and coerce him? No community can impose that kind of onerous taxation on its community members. The Chavos Yair also writes the same idea. He says, "V'yisal that he lives even before the Chassam Sofer." He says, "V'yisal kadaitich dahavi midarabanan lahavi kasav hatur pachos mizeh ayin ra rak hayelolomar dahavi avrayan." Because the language of the Torah was that if a person gives 10% of his income to tzedakah, he's a mida beinanis. This is a person of average generosity. Person gives more, between 10 and 20%, is ayin tova. He's a good eye. Person gives less than 10%, he's an ayin ra. He's a miserly eye. Okay, but what does that imply? Okay, you're a miserly guy. Are you a rasha? Are you a bad person? Are you committing averos? No. See, that's the Chavos Yair's inference. All we can do is say, you're not so generous with your money, but does that mean you're a sinner? No, you're not a sinner. Shaloniskar b'shas rak shir meiser v'chulei, because the Gemara only talks about agricultural tithes. It does not talk about income tithes. Umikol makom mishanaha ken yomim rabim shavia olechova dahavalei neder v'chulei. However, if a person has regularly practiced this custom and has been doing it for years, it becomes obligatory upon him because it becomes like a neder, it becomes like a vow. In which case, it might be subject to hataras nedarim, but you would have to specify it when you get hataras nedarim. Klishas dati nota kebach ad kan lashono va'ayin od mashakosov bepischei tshuva. And he says, and he says, I side therefore with the Bach, who says that there's no mitzvah whatsoever. And he refers us to the Pischei Tshuva, which I don't have in front of me, but maybe I'll get that for tomorrow. So then he writes, but ulam b'taz nakat sheyesh chiyuv gomer la'aser ksafim v'yesh l'damosa l'maiser ani shel tavua. He says this is where the Taz it acts as a very strong contrast to the aforementioned, because he writes that it's like maiser ani, it's an agricultural tithe for the poor. V'zel shano. Nira diyesh l'damot ma'aser shemafrishim in harevach mamon l'din meiser ani shel hatvu uperos. He says, it seems to me that this is akin to an agricultural tithe for the poor. Umori chamikas of shahamaiser shalmam and shalanu ein bo chiyuv lo min haTorah v'lo mid'Rabbanan. And then he quotes his father-in-law. The father-in-law of the Taz was the Bach, who was completely lenient and said there's no source for this either in the Torah or in the rabbinic sources. He says, I know that that's what my father-in-law said, but v'tamahati shaharei reish siman reish mem tes mevuar shechiv gamerhu kamo shekasvu kol hapoiskim v'abeis Yosef b'shem ha'Yerushalmi ad kam l'shana. But he said, I don't understand how my father-in-law could say that. It seems to be cited in the Shulchan Aruch as well, at the very beginning of Reish Mem Tes. Uche'ein ze kasav b'sefer chasidim v'zel l'shano, oto ma'aser ksafim hu meiser ani l'seis lani meiser mikol asher yaviach adam. And then he quotes also from the Sefer Chasidim, which is a medieval sefer from from the 13th century, who says that it is a tradition to give a tenth of your income, just like you give a tenth of your agriculture to the poor. So you see that Taz is a very strong language to say that it is a halacha. Va'od, and maybe we'll take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan at the beginning of Siman Reish Mem Tes. He says, Va'od beveis lechem Yehuda nokat shemaiser ksafim hu chiyuv v'shenohagu laseis laniyim davka. He says in the Sefer Beis Lechem Yehuda, he writes that tithing 10% for the poor specifically is an obligation, and v'zel l'shana u'v'asher shekol ha'poiskim achronim kasav d'maiser ksafim einu elam minhag kain kasav ma'arami Rutenberg. He says, yes, I know that the other poskim say that it's merely a custom, and he quotes from the Rishon, the Ma'arami Rutenberg, who seems to say the same thing. He says that doesn't mean to say that the din of Meiser Ani is not sourced properly, but it's rather just a minhag. He says Devade lo nela mimenu hasifri muva b'maseches tainis dinilmad ma'aser ksafim me'ez kol tevuas zar echa. He says there is a halachic midrash called the Sifri that says that we derive the laws of Meiser Ksafim, of tithing one's income, from the pasuk in the Torah that talks about tithing your agriculture. It says kol tevuas arechel, all of the grain of your seeds, and so that implies that extra word kol means not just your agriculture but also your finances. Ella wrote Salomar demashanos de Meiser Ksafim la'aniyim ze'enu min haTorah v'lo midrabanan. But all that the rabbis meant to say is taking that full 10% and giving it to the poor does not have a basis, because technically a person could say, I'm going to take 10% of my income and use it for mitzvos in general and not just for the poor. And because this has been a long-standing practice of giving 10% of one's income to the poor, one should not change it. It's almost as if the aniyim of every generation have sort of a claim on that money by this point. He says, and then he quotes in the brackets from the Sefer Orach Tzedakah, quoting from Rav Nissim Karelitz, who says, "Shebizmanenu haminag lated lo rak la'aniyim elagam l'shar mitzvot." That nowadays the custom has reverted to using one's 10% for other mitzvot as well, not just for the poor. V'zel l'shano shamati mehagon Rav Nissim Karelitz shlita sha'afim lo hitna merosh yuchal lated lemitzvot rashai da'adaita deminhag nosein dehaminhag shenos demaiser ksafim gam lemitzvot. He says, even if you didn't make that declaration when you accepted upon yourself to tithe your income, it nevertheless is the prevailing practice that when people give 10%, they give it not just exclusively to the poor, but will give it to other causes as well, like my shul membership and like the mikveh and the day school, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So it was given every third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle,
But we're talking now about somehow pulling them.
annually, and annually.
So we.
Yeah. So he even says, I'm just looking at the footnote. He says that which the Taz writes, Shemaiser Ksafim hu bidin Meiser Ani Lichora hu Chiddush Gadol, Kamosha Kasav HaBeis Meir. He says, we don't know where the Taz gets this from. It's very innovative, and it seems he pulled it out of thin air. Zelashonam, Shein al Meiser Ksafim din Meiser Ani Afilu Midarabanan. He writes that no, taking 10% of your income is not based on Meiser Ani. V'lachein Kasav HaTur v'chein Pasuk HaRama. And it's on that basis that the Tur and the Ramah both write, Sheparnasas Atzmo Kodemes L'chol Adam, that your sustenance takes priority over everybody else. Ve'eno chayav lateit tzedakah ad shetiyeh lo parnasasa. You're not obligated to give tzedakah to others until you have enough income to live off of. In other words, we know that even poor people have to give tzedakah, right? We know that. But you're not obligated to give more than a few pennies, because you have to make sure that you have parnasa before you start giving your money away to others. V'ilu b'maiser ani b'vur b'tor shafilu ani should Yisrael motzi mimenu bal karchel. But when it comes to actual maiser ani from your agriculture, we can forcefully confiscate that from you, and that's certainly not true with the 10% of tzedakah. So it's clear that we don't treat it the exact same way. So for the Taz to say that it's derived from that halacha, you see that halachically that's simply not so. Okay. Now, let's just go next to the next paragraph. Ve'ilu habirke Yosef kasav shemaser ksafim buchiv midarabanan midin tzedakah v'zel lashona. He says the Birkei Yosef writes that there is a rabbinic law of taking 10%, but it's not based on Meiser Ani, but rather it's a mitzvah of tzedakah, b'zel lashona. V'nira vadai the Meiser ksafim eno misug Meiser Ani rak chiyav tzedakah v'hu chiyav midarabanan ad kan lashona. All he simply says is that it's not based on Meiser Ani, but it is based on the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. Harei shenakat sheyesh chiyav midarabanan la'aser ksafim midin tzedakah v'lo midin meiser ani. Okay, he just reiterates that. Uvehemshech dvarav hosef ezel l'shana. Uvaofan demikol ha'amor mashma demidamim ma'aser ksafim lezera haaretz. He says it would seem that from all of the aforementioned that we compare Meiser Ksafim to agriculture. The Habi Yerushalmi v'Sifri v'Tanchumas Mechu Akra to Meiser Tavua. He says that midrash that we saw the other opinion quote is really just an asmachta. It's not really a biblical law. It's just to sort of connect the two loosely based on rabbinic convention. Ume'acher shekain nema nami dechihechi demeiser tavua tzarach lahafrish mikol asher totzi haaretz afilu tzarach leparnasaso uadin meiser ksafim nami yotzi mikol asher yarviach af tzarach lahotzi mimen tzarchim mizanosu parnasa akal l'shona. Says on that basis, it would seem that even though I really need that 10% to sustain myself and my family, I still have an obligation to do so. So we'll have to continue this idea tomorrow because we're already out of time. But I do want to do a little bit more research before we pull away from this topic. Okay? All right, we'll continue.